All right. Well, I am Greg Watson. I am conducting this interview for SLC 442, Dracula and Vampire Lore through Arizona State University. I have with me Mr. Christopher Irving. He is a teacher at the Virginia Commonwealth University, correct?
Yep, in Richmond, Virginia.
Awesome. And he has a bachelor's from Virginia Commonwealth U in art education. He has a master's in comparative literature from Brooklyn College.
Brooklyn College. Yeah, City University of New York, Brooklyn. Best, some of the best 2 years of my life. Great program, great people.
Awesome.
Great city.
But I actually ended up reaching out to Mr. Irving because he appeared as a guest on a documentary that we had to watch for class called Monsters Among Us, yes. which he also wrote and produced himself as well. The very first episode talks about vampirism and how some of those legends began from the beginning of Greek mythology and all of that. As a matter of fact, he also right now teaches a vampires in film course himself. And can you kind of tell us a little bit about what your course entails and what kind of the educational goals of it are?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question. I do want to put a shout out in terms of Monsters Among Us. My friend Eric Miller did a lot of the really heavy lifting on it. I wrote it, but he really just worked his tail off filming and editing. He was kind of a one-man crew because we had such a low budget. But no, it still blows my mind that of all things I've worked on, that's the one that most people, like I see it literally pop up and I hear about it. I'll tell you, vampire in film is actually an art history. I'm in communication arts. I'm full-term assistant professor, but my summers are free. And I started this class in art history, I guess 2.5 years ago. And it covers just like this kind of gamut of, I literally just got a text from Eric Miller. That's spooky. So we're like this. So this is a guy I went to school with in Richmond, and we lived together. Well, not together, but we both lived in Richmond. And I wouldn't bump into him in Richmond, but when I went to San Diego Comic-Con, the biggest comics convention, at that point, probably still in the world, I would bump into Eric. It was the damnedest thing. Like, we live in a small city and wouldn't see one another, but at this crazy show, we'd randomly be, oh yeah, hey Chris, hey, yeah, Chris. I'm like, Eric, dude. Anyways, so vampire in film. I was offered the chance to teach it, and I decided to do it online. I wanted to look into teaching online, which was very helpful to me once this whole pandemic thing hit, but it basically covers Dracula for the first half. You need to cover Dracula. Like you can't do a modern vampire course and not cover Dracula, not just the films, but also the book. The book is such a vital piece of Gothic horror and genre fiction. It's a book I try and read since I was a kid every 2 years at least. So Dracula is a huge component, and we have different variations of Dracula, different versions. Of course, we watch Nosferatu, we watch Todd Browning's Dracula. I put horror of Dracula with my favorite Dracula ever, Christopher Lee. There is Gary Oldman and Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula. And there's so many other, versions that I just don't have the time to fit in. But I also, put more contemporary approaches to the vampire, like The Lost Boys is a big one. Interview with the Vampire, of course, is a huge one that most of my students haven't seen, which still kind of fascinates me. Of course, What We Do in the Shadows is like the big one at the end. That's my favorite. I love Taika Waititi. I think he is a downright genius and one of the, he's just, him on Thor, that was
Mhm.
one of those shut your mouth type of moments that
Oh,
I still can't
absolutely.
believe happened. And that Mark Mothersbaugh score is just a killer.
Mhm.
But yeah, so it's it's an exploration of the vampire genre in film mostly, though they are required to read Bram Stoker's Dracula. And it's also really just a way for the students to see how vampirism can be used as a narrative device in different ways. It can, like you look at Kronos, for instance, by Guillermo del Toro, and it's this really beautiful fairy tale of a movie about an unconventional vampire, also with elements of addiction.
Mhm.
But it's a magical film. It's terrible as things get in it. Also when you put in, of course, The Lost Boys, you put that into context of the AIDS scare of the 1980s. There's so many different ways, and Ganja and Hess, which I showed once, and my students had. So Ganja and Hess, for those of you who haven't seen it, I hope you have, but it's a 70s black vampire film starring Dwayne Jones who played Ben in Night of the Living Dead.
Mhm.
What's so brilliant about the film is the director was expected to make like a Blackula, like a black exploitation film,
Mhm.
but instead he made this like stunning art house film about vampirism and addiction and sex and in African, and kind of rooting it into African culture. And it's a stunning piece of work. It's a brilliant piece of work. We also watched Blackula, which is one of my favorite vampire films as well. So that's kind of it. We watch movies, we meet up. I encourage the students to have their own opinions and disagree and agree, but they have to have a rationale. And it's like great. It's one of my favorite classes. Always fills up. It's a mainstay of my summers.
That's awesome. Yeah, our course actually is not set up that much differently than yours. We started out with of course Monsters Among Us was actually the very first thing that we covered, and
Right.
it was incredibly educational. Like we hit the ground running with Monsters Among Us.
Thank you.
He has not seen it. If we end up sending this to YouTube or the Facebooks or whatnot, if anybody has not seen it, it definitely hits the ground running and sets that baseline for everything else from the course, even before Dracula, right? The Greek Lamii and everything else that first episode covers. And then we kind of move on. We read some of the early Gothic literature, like you highlighted, Polydorus and the Vampire.
Oh yeah. Poor John Polidori. That was my friend Connor who played John Polidori.
in the docu-series.
Yes. And Polidori is like the biggest loser. Because he I know. Okay, he died of arsenic poisoning. Say hi to Simon Poindexter, please. So, sorry, but like I think of Connor like played it with so much humor. But yeah, I mean, John Polidori basically had this love-hate relationship with Lord Byron. So he wanted Lord Byron to love him, right? And Byron couldn't stand him. And so what he did after he was ousted, kind of kicked off the island, right? Kind of kicked out of
the Cool Kids Club.
Yeah, well, he basically ripped off this throwaway idea that Byron had, and he wrote it like Byron in Byron style. And the publisher, because copyright laws were a little different back then, but the publisher stole the copyright. I think they established it in their name, so he didn't make any money, but it was credited to Lord Byron. Which I'm sorry, but I think that's like universal karma. I don't have a very high opinion of Lord Byron personally. I think he was well, I don't want to I don't want to say anything inappropriate, but I have a very, if I were to meet Lord Byron in real life, I would probably think he was a joke, not take him seriously, and just not be a fan of him. He seems like he was just kind of a terrible dude. But yeah, Polidori basically, like, I think he had accrued a lot of gambling debt and just like drank arsenic. I'm like, wow, you know, it's like he alone is, I think, an interesting story. Have you read The Vampire, right?
We did.
Kind of a lame story, isn't it? Like, it's just kind of like, okay, you know.
And that's something that we kind of a few of the students and I kind of noticed is that a lot of the short stories are they're a bit direct, to like point to point, because when they are short stories, and we were actually wondering why short stories were so prevalent as opposed to the longer novels like Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Right.
Even the modern Prometheus was relatively short.
Yeah, yeah. Well, keep in mind, publishing back then was different. They had penny dreadfuls, you know, these cheap magazines that well, Varney the Vampire, you're aware of him, right?
I believe so.
Okay, so Varney the Vampire was a penny dreadful, and what a penny dreadful was these throwaway penny just digests, right? That they were serialized. And so the stories would take place from one month to the next, to the next, to the next. And Varney the Vampire is one of the longest, if not the run. I think it's one of, I don't think it's the longest, but one of the longest running penny dreadfuls. And it just keeps going, right? And it's just junk culture. Like, it's a really bad story. Yeah, even Simon agrees. And Varney actually ends with Varney jumping into the mouth of a volcano. And, but what's funny, and you didn't see this, do you remember the scenes of myself and there's this young redheaded woman, and they're like snippets, and I had longer hair back then. I had to grow it out for another part. During Monsters Among Us, Eric wanted to film Barney the Vampire, like scenes from it as if it were like this Italian 70s horror film, right? And one of these days, but like, I'm doing the whole thing like, yes, this is a bad idea, which is an actual line, but we do the whole thing. Oh yes, and we were like reading the dialogue, but I don't know what Eric's ever going to do with that. Anyways, I'm sorry.
Use it for blackmail one of these days.
Man, I'm proud of it, actually. It's so bad.
There you go.
It's so funny, like intentionally. So you had things like Penny Dreadful, right? Then you had magazines like The Strand, which published Sherlock Holmes. And so you would have different magazine publications would pick up short stories, which I imagine may have been easier, or it might have been sold more as just a small short story itself. That's my guess, and there may be a totally different reason. I'm not positive offhand, but I will say that Frankenstein was published in 3 small volumes initially. And oftentimes, like, books would sometimes find, okay, Picture of Dorian Gray is a great example. That was published originally in a magazine. And when it was published in book form, it was re-edited to make it less gay, frankly. The original one, which I'm proud to say one of my mentors, Dr. Nicholas Frankel at VCU, who's a lovely, brilliant man who's also an expert in Oscar Wilde, he compiled the uncensored Dorian Gray, right? His original format. So it wasn't, they didn't have like the paperback market like we do today, where a story can just go out in paperback. It was a very different publishing model. So my guess, and this is kind of a long-winded, I don't fully know answer, but just to be honest, but my honest guess is that vampires just weren't popular enough, and Bram Stoker's Dracula really, because it tapped into the Victorian fear of sex, it tapped into a fear of immigrants, it tapped into all of these modern day phobias, and it also has this sense of reality to it, right? Verisimilitude, so to speak, because everything is first person, and it even includes news clippings. I feel like if Dracula were not successful, we may not have vampires being half of what they are today. You know, when you look at the vampire short stories that predated it, you know, how many really are raging successes? I mean, how many people do you know are like, oh, Lord Ruthven from the Vampire, he's my favorite movie villain, you know?
Carmilla is another one.
Which one?
Carmilla, the female vampire from right around the same era.
What a great story, right? And that story has so much more weight to it. And I feel like that's a story I don't think would be very good if it had been a novella even. The fact that it's a short story, like that format, I think allows you to have more of a punch, right? You can get more to the point. You know, and because there's more to work with. I've seen like a film adaptation or two of Carmilla. I know I saw a really bad one from the 90s. I think I was a kid. I think Nicole Eggert was in it from Baywatch and Charles in Charge. I'm dating myself here. Yes, I'm old, but yeah, I mean, there's much to be had, even if you dig, you know, and look at the more esoteric stories that never really, pardon the pun, but saw the light of day. But the reason Dracula, I mean, gosh, I think Dracula really takes the cake because it's, even today, a really convincing, really scary novel. Yeah, I mean, it if anything taps into the Victorian fear of the other and of temptation and so forth, I would say it's definitely Dracula.
Interesting. And before we kind of branch out to like vampirism, to stay on Dracula, from what 1931's, you know, Bela Lugosi version to Gary Oldman's to, well, because he's your favorite, we'll include Christopher Lee in there as well. So Bela Lugosi to Christopher Lee to Gary Oldman, all the way to Luke Evans, right? Mm-hmm. How do you think that? Why do you think Dracula has managed to survive through 70 years of film at that point?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a lot of it's, I mean, he's iconic for one. He's public domain for two. You know?
That's a very good point.
Anyone can make I could make a Dracula movie, you know, and no one could really, you know, as long as I wasn't doing a direct version pulled from, you know, like Klaus Bang from the BBC series, or you know, the Dracula Untold with Luke Evans, who I think is one of the best choices for Dracula ever. I just didn't think it was a good movie. You know, it's kind of dead to me. Dead joke. But I think much of it is that since there's very little to Dracula when you think about it. And because there's so little to him, because Dracula is really about the people around him. It's about Mina, it's about Jonathan, Dr. Seward, Holmwood, and it's literally from their perspective, right? So it's all about them. So you can do a story where it's all about how people deal with this monster who embodies, you know, their greatest fears. He could be animalistic, he could be seductive, he could be uninhibited, he could be cruel, he could be tragic, but there's something in Dracula through different interpretations, and also because when you think of Bram Stoker's original version, we know very little about Dracula as a person. You know, does he like milk or blood on his cornflakes? I don't know. You know, we know nothing about him. We only know what other people tell us about him. And so that air of mystery can create a better, greater air of fear, right? So if you want to do a movie like that, you can effectively make one, which I think Horror of Dracula with Christopher Lee is. The reason he's my favorite Dracula is because he's physically imposing, he's sexy as hell, and he's stoic, but he's also fast, you know? Like there's a scene where he like leaps across the table at Van Helsing And it's just like it's just scary, right? But I also think that as a character, you have a lot to work with Dracula. You can tell a story about him, trying to reunite himself with the reincarnation of his lost love, which we'll forget that that's totally ripped off from Blackula. But you can tell a story where he's a lonely monster and he's just trying to find companionship, but he's a victim of his own instinct. So you have a character whose name recognition, brand recognition, right?
Mhm.
Public domain, very malleable. You can fit him into really any time period. You can do modern, you can do period. You could do a futuristic science fiction Dracula film. I'm sure there have been some done or made, you can do all of these things with him, but there's still something innate within that character that we both fear and am in awe of.
Mhm.
How would we react if we could have that great power, but with that great cost?
Mhm.
How would we react if we could have the opportunity to potentially live forever, but have to kill on a regular basis? There's just so much to work with. And the fact that, it's the book's about 140 years old, maybe, and we're still talking about it. The fact that you even ask that question, and I even teach a class with it, and you even take a class with it.
Mhm. Absolutely.
So there you go. I mean, that's just my rambly hypothesis.
No,
God,
you bring up a fantastic point, as far as especially in the earlier films with Bela Lugosi and Christopher Lee, even Gary Oldman. Really, it's
Yeah.
about it was always about like how Dracula affected the people around him, and there's a very new perspective for me hearing that from you,
Thanks.
especially with the shift into like the Clive Bang version that just dropped and Dracula Untold, even, where it kind of like is indicative of a shift in at least American culture, to where we're interested more in how he himself exists and things like that. Because I mean the BBC series, the first two episodes not so much, but that third episode was very much focused on Dracula as a person, like as a being, and Dracula Untold was not very different than that. Like it was very trying to humanize him and seeing where he came from, actually.
Yeah, and I think that's to me the tragedy of that film. It isn't that the story itself wasn't good. It was a good story, but it was just so predictable.
Mm.
You could see everything coming.
Mhm.
And that happens when something's plotted, right? So a story is what really happens to a person or a character, how they're affected by the end. Like if you want to say the Francis Ford Coppola Dracula, it's about an immortal monster finding peace. If you want to, but if you want to talk about Dracula Untold, the story should be about this warrior, right, who sacrificed his humanity to save his people. But that sacrifice has no effect if you know that it's about him making the sacrifice.
Yes, agreed.
And when you introduce, his beautiful wife, and I think has a son in it, maybe,
Yes.
and it's like, okay, well, we know what's coming. It's kind of predictable.
Absolutely.
30 days later, I had no idea what was going to happen in 30 days later, which I think is an underrated vampire film. One of my favorites, From Dusk Till Dawn, I had no clue what was going to happen, because that's a story about George Clooney's character,
Mhm.
right? And it's not about what happens. It's about how he's affected at the end.
Exactly, and that's a fantastic shift point, just because like outside of Dracula as a character and how he as embodiment kind of affects the characters in his stories and how he's managed to survive because of that, right? Like all of the different fears and all of our different, cultural desires to understand him now, like with Dracula Untold and Clive Bang's version. But vampires as a legion, like vampirism, right? We have like you said, 30 Days of Night and From Dusk Till Dawn. Most of those vampires as legion movies, even I Am Legend, whether it's the Omega Man or the Will Smith version.
The Last Man on Earth with Vincent Price. Have you seen that?
I have not seen that version.
Okay. All right. So Vincent Price, I'm sorry, please forgive me if I tend to go off on tangents.
Oh, we have plenty of time, sir.
Vincent Price is one of my favorite actors ever, but it's an American international film. And there's this one scene, and I came on it in this one scene. I was flipping the channels back, what we did before streaming, right? And he's the last man on Earth, and he's watching a home movie, with a projector, because it was like the 60s, of his family. And it's this kid's birthday party, and he starts laughing, and he just breaks down in tears, but it's continuous. And it should be public domain and easy to find. Actually, I need to put that on my curriculum this year if I haven't. But it's I Am Legend, Richard Matheson. It's the same story. Mm-hmm. But I'm so sorry, I sidetracked. What was your question again? Yeah.
This is all like fantastic, especially because I wasn't even aware that existed as even the first, the OG film based off of that.
Yes.
I always thought it was the Charlton Heston one.
Oh no, yeah, the Omega Man. No, it was Last Man on Earth, which is just, it's Vincent Price. Like this is the thing. I don't think we have B movie actors like we did back then. You had people like Vincent Price, Peter Cushing, Christopher Lee, whatever they were in, they elevated it. So you could have a B movie production, but you had an A-level performance. I think if you look at Christopher Lee in the Star Wars prequels, like Darth Tyrannus, Count Dooku was powerful. Like I look at, he must have been like in the 70s or something. He was getting older, couldn't do his own stunts for obvious reasons. But these were actors who had this incredible presence. And so you could have something that's super low budget, but it still like gets you, it's like, my cats. Okay. I wanted to make sure my cat wasn't being a jerk to the other cat.
Yeah, mine have the tendency to do that right around dinner time.
Yep. These guys have been fed, but my boy can be a real jerk. So, there's a movie I was going to ask you. Oh, I did get to finish Near Dark last night.
Okay, Catherine Bigelow.
Amazing. Except this is like her first movie, right? Or one of her first films. And she's like an amazing director, except with explosions. Because to me, the whole final act like falls apart when like everything blows up. Like you can't just catch on fire. It has to like, spoiler, it has to go, but it's like 1990s style, you know?
Yeah.
But I love the concept of these monstrous vampires who don't have any common sense. Like they are literally, like there's a scene in the bar, which was horrifying to me. Like it's a great film. It's hard to get a hold of now, but if you haven't seen it, whoever's watching this, like it's incredible. There's this one scene towards the climax that's just like gut-wrenchingly good. But yeah, they're just like, they're pure instinct and they're not thinking, they just like, they're gross and dirty and they just steal, it's just, I don't want to spoil anymore, but it was a really interesting take because, when you see vampires in most films, they have control over what they are.
Mhm.
They know the rules. Or in the case of, Interview with a Vampire, they know enough to seek out the rules, right? Or if you look at the Lost Boys, they know the rules. And what's interesting to me is Near Dark is like a mature version of the Lost Boys.
Agreed.
You know,
100%.
yeah, it's almost the same plot, but without the pastiche and tongue in cheek.
And they came out within a year or two of each other, I believe.
Very close, yeah.
And those two in particular, especially at that early to mid 90s era, the point that you made about them knowing the rules, right? And the Lost Boys in particular, just because it's a bit more mainstream than Near Dark is, they knew the rules, but they didn't really care about them.
Right.
Which was neat as far as that whole like early pre-turn of the millennium punk era, and the whole idea of like the rocker Lost Boys thing. So having that reflected was very neat.
Yeah.
But Near Dark. I'm sorry.
No, after you.
Oh, Near Dark. You put it perfectly. It was a bit more of the mature side of things, to where it wasn't necessarily trying to reach the mainstream idea of youthful rebellion as much as just the savagery of it.
Yeah, and it's like it reminds me of a 70s film. Like this has this real grit to it. And it was an amazing cast, all very young, But I think it's funny with the Lost Boys, because Joel Schumacher went on to direct the Batman films. He did Batman Forever and Batman and Robin. And what's so funny about the Batman films he did was they were like, so in the 90s, before, computer technology, and he's got a leaf stuck in his fur, in editing was really that, advanced, they would make these blockbusters that had like massive sets, and because so much was still practical. And Schumacher was doing what he was paid to, was make a family-friendly blockbuster Batman film. But I look at the Lost Boys, and I'm like, Schumacher should have been doing like a street level, low, modest budget, like Batman, like an urban Batman film.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you look at that film, like he really did not have much money. There are a lot of kind of quick cuts and edits for like when they fly, I mean, you don't really see them fly.
The camera first person panning up.
Yeah. Or, they cut, or they'd be like fog behind them, like, whoa, but like the lighting in that movie is killer. Like it's a beautiful film. I'm like, dude, if Schumacher had made a Dark Knight film that way, it would have been dead on, man. I would have loved to have seen him do like a really mature Dracula film, because I think he could have done it. I think he was a really underrated, really fantastic director. He did a couple bad movies,
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, but it's interesting seeing, just kind of how the vampire, because when I was, a kid, and I was kind of like I was the only goth kid in my high school, located next to a cow field, not far from here. There weren't very many of us that loved vampires, and so I think things like Dracula and Interview with the Vampire were a treat, but I don't feel like it really blew up into the mainstream, blew up till you hit like Twilight. You'd have vampire films, but it was never like a big phenomenon until Twilight, at least not to me, not that level phenomenon. And I'm really curious to see what those fans are going to latch on to, now that they're getting all grown up, can watch, I have my opinions about Twilight. They're not, I appreciate what they are, but
is that something that you wouldn't mind exploring a little? Just because it was almost bound to come up. Because interestingly enough, I don't believe that we cover that in this course at all. So just like quickly talking about.
Okay, I'll give you my thoughts on it, and I'm going to give you an experience I had with one of my students who I'm very proud of. Okay, so the thing is, I'm not a fan of Twilight. I saw the first one. it was a last minute date with a girl I met at a coffee shop. And she was like, I want to go see Twilight. I'm like, yeah, what the hell? Let's go see it. You know, and what I liked about it was that it really had this, I could see it being like this cult kitsch thing. You know what I mean? Like, it's kind of dumb. You know, Robert Pattinson I thought was great given what he had to work with, but it wasn't. It was a very goofy movie. I had a student ask me in my visual communications class, you know, why are you teaching that in vampire? I'm like, God, no. Why not? I'm like, it's a crappy movie. I'm like, it's not, it doesn't meet the bar as Let the Right One In, which is one I'm going to show this year. And, you know, I'm like, it just doesn't, it doesn't make enough of a contribution that makes me feel like it's really going to have a huge lasting impact. And she had a wonderful point. She's like, well, it's early, really successful franchise movie series, which it is. And I think that a lot of what they did with Twilight and also Harry Potter kind of set the groundwork for like the Marvel films in particular, you know, franchise films that could be produced on a modest to good budget and relatively quickly. But she also was like, it's from a female director based off a novel by a female writer. I'm like, oh, I didn't realize that. That's like a really good point, because it's like a vastly successful, you know, vampire film, the first one at least. I mean, my overall feeling, have you seen Robert Pattinson talk about the movies?
I have seen a little bit of his mention.
He's brilliant, because if you guys haven't, just look up Robert Pattinson Twilight interviews. And I think even when he was in them towards the end, he was just like, he was just he was just laughing at how bad they were. And that was smart of him, because it helped him create a distance, you know, so he didn't get typecast. And now, I mean, look at, I mean, he's going to be Batman, but he's like The Lighthouse. I mean, he's like an incredible actor, right? I think that I also hate Twilight because it ruined Comic-Con. You know, San Diego Comic-Con used to be a place that I could go to, see my friends who work in the industry, find that secret bar that no one else knows about, and just talk till 2 a.m., 5 a.m. my time, because I'm Eastern. And once they started letting Twilight in, it kind of opened the floodgates for like movie studios. And you know, tickets were selling out because there were these like 12-year-old girls camping out for like a week and buying up the I mean, it was just a disaster. Twilight had no business being in Comic-Con. I also personally have issues with Twilight. I just don't think it's not, they're not a book series that I'd want like my 12-year-old niece reading, because I don't think they model or exhibit healthy relationships. You know, the Vampire Lestat doesn't, but that's a horror book for adults. You know, it's not a YA book. So I'm not a fan. You know, I'm not a fan. I think they're just dumb. I get that you know, people love them, but I think a lot of that love comes from just growing up with them, you know. And I can appreciate that, and I can appreciate what they accomplished with Twilight. But you know, for me, I don't look at Twilight going, okay, this has changed how vampires are portrayed. You know, to me, a lot of it's just a watered down version of the Lost Boys. You know, so it's a little harder for me to really want to give up an entire class period for it. You know, it's like, hey guys, let's watch this like amazing foreign vampire film, or let's watch Twilight. You know, when you
absolutely.
Yeah, when you teach, you have to balance that stuff out.
Yeah, with Twilight though, and the whole idea of like vampire romance and what have you, and you brought up Lestat as well. In our course, vampire. No, I actually even watching Monsters Among Us, there was the mention that Anne Rice kind of brought about the idea of the sexy vampire, and I guess, you know, with the 80s and the 90s, that kind of is where an American cultural shift in values kind of ended up allowing that to thrive. And that's kind of something that we've talked about in the course as well is how it was sort of suggested that vampires in film and literature were kind of these monstrous things, Nosferatu and things like that. And then they somehow just over time shifted into these seductive characters like Lestat or Edward Cullen and things like that. But from everything that I've seen, there's always been some level of sexual undertones to most vampire stories.
Mhm.
So I'm curious whether or not you think that that is the case, or whether there was a dramatic shift at some point in
In like the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
Right? I give okay, so this is just my view.
Mhm.
And this is more of a working thesis, right? Is I feel like there's the Dracula type and there's the Lestat type, right? And the Lestat type is completely uninhibited. Dracula has a degree of inhibitions, and I know it differs from, kind of film to film or book to book or whatever. I think Dracula has more of a code than Lestat does, at least in the early days. Early days being Interview with the Vampire, Vampire Lestat in Queen of the Damned. I think that what Anne Rice did so great, so beautifully with Interview is she made vampirism an analogy for addiction. She had suffered from alcoholism. She did that, but I think she thought more about what a vampire could be. If you look at like Dark Shadows, the soap, it was a soap opera with a vampire, ran for several years, Barnabas Collins. There was like, kind of a degree of, there was a lot of romance in those as well. And I feel like that might have, I wouldn't be surprised if that kind of set the kind of the tone for a character like Lestat to happen, because now people might be thinking a little bit outside of Dracula. I love the fact that she's like, look, they don't have blood flowing through their bodies. How are they going to have sex? Like, when you really think about it, it makes perfect sense. And so if they can't have sex in like the physical carnal way, well, then how did they, how did they get their jollies on, for want of a better term? I'm sorry, it's not an academic term, but work with me here.
It's in my final project, so it's an academic
yeah,
term
it
now.
is an academic term now. See, okay, that's
No.
an academic term. You can cite it. But no, seriously, it's, so their sex is drinking blood. And so if their sex is drinking blood and it's not dependent upon sexual organs, then why do they even have to be heterosexual? Why, I mean, it totally makes sense the way she does it. But I don't think that she really came about it in a way that was, overly explained, right? It just seems like it kind of, one idea evolves out of another. And that's one of the things I love about, her vampires, is that she, I think, puts them on a certain emotional kind of tier that many others don't, including interrelationships between the vampires, like Lestat and Louis and, Marius and Claudia and so forth. And Gabrielle's a big one, Lestat's mom. And it's taboo. A lot of the stuff in there is really weird, but I think that underscores the vampire as being a subversive figure, and because remember, early 80s, it's not like, I have very many, friends and students who are LGBTQ, and I know that they still suffer and they still deal with a lot of issues on just from a civil rights level. And also on a very human level, about being safe and being allowed to be themselves. So you look back to the early 80s, I imagine it was much worse. The older LGBTQ folks I know, some of them died still in the closet because they still had, that was kind of what was baked into them. And so I think there's something very brave about her vampires because of that. And I have to say, just, complete um, you know, just to be completely transparent, you know, I grew up in the 90s in a small town, literally called Farmville. That's the name of my hometown. It's a college town. And for those of you who weren't around in the 90s, if you watch a 90s film, especially like a teen film or an adult a sex comedy especially, they do not they do not age well. And a lot of it is that it was a more openly homophobic time, right? And I lived in a small town, and I didn't know very many, you know, gay people even. I met some through the theater group that I worked with at Longwood College. I was still in high school, and I was doing work. I was in a play and so forth. But I think that her books really helped me to just, you know, it made me feel like I had a little more of an understanding about it. And so like, I really, you know, even though I don't love her later books, and some of her writing might be a little kind of obtuse and kind of flowery, and there may be stuff that I just don't love about her work, you know, her books. But my God, what that woman did was, I think, A, brave, and B, pushed the vampire beyond being something we're kind of scared of on a social level. It's like, okay, this is what you're scared of. Hey, guess what? If you're homophobic, Lestat's even scarier to you now, because Lestat finds other men beautiful, you know, but also growing up, you know, as, you know, like a 15, 16-year-old, because, you know, when you're a 15, 16-year-old boy, everything's about your masculinity, right? You know, kind of like how manly you are when you still are not even shaving more than like once every 2 weeks. It's kind of absurd. If my son ever starts to struggle with toxic masculinity issues, you know, hopefully he won't, but, you know, so it's kind of absurd in retrospect. But for me to read that, it's like, you know, okay, like he can love another man, and he can see beauty in another man, you know. And I think that she didn't open a can of worms with that, but I think she really liberated the vampire more than being just a boogeyman who we're scared of because the boogeyman liked sex or the boogeyman could carry disease. I also think that the smartest thing she did next to that, or alongside that, was she created Akasha and Enkill, who were the first vampires who were Egyptian. And she tied it into the Osiris myth. So she actually created vampires as more than just this ungodly monstrosity. She created vampires as this mythology, and she linked it to Africa. It's great, wonderful, because everyone else before had looked at it as like this Christian pagan thing, which you could do, but she went like straight to like an established myth, the Osiris myth, and I thought it tied in really well. I thought it was a stroke of genius, to be honest. And I think that she created this bigger sandbox she could play in. And so she made vampires more. She made them more important. She made them bigger. I think she made them more appealing because they would do things that we in polite society can't, you know. And I think the appeal of Lestat is that he is like Dracula in a lot of ways. So when you read Dracula, you only see things through everyone else's perspective. Mm-hmm. When you read Interview with a Vampire, it's all from Louis's perspective. So everything Lestat does might seem monstrous. When you read The Vampire Lestat, Lestat covers a lot of what he did through his perspective. Mm-hmm. So you not only get both sides, but then when you watch the movie, Tom Cruise performed Lestat, I feel, with a sense of knowing what Lestat was really trying to do. So you look at it from, oh my God, Lestat's a monster. He's not letting, you know, Claudette and Louis away. He turned this little girl into a vampire, and, you know, he's a monster. But then if you look at it from more human terms, understanding where Lestat came from, it's like, it's a married couple who get pregnant to try and keep the marriage together. That's it. And maybe it's a toxic relationship, but and as messed up as it is,
Mhm.
Lestat kind of did that out of love. He did that because he wanted to make Louis happy, so Louis would stay with him. And it's just, again, that's why I love Anne Rice and why I love those early books, especially. And I think that she brought a warmth and a humanity to the vampires. She also doesn't deal with crosses. They can see their reflection. She grounds them, I think, in more of the real world, which in turn makes them more believable and makes them a little scarier, even though it did kind of go off the rails, and got a little bigger and crazier as she progressed. Those core books, man, I mean, that to me is like, that's the best vampire world building ever made. And I feel like anything I've seen from it, that's not to say that there's not something better that I just haven't discovered, but my feeling is everything from there on is just a watered down version of what she did. So much love to Mrs. Rice. So
Absolutely. That's definitely, that was different. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say she pushed the envelope. I was rambling. I do it.
No, that was an incredible bit of insight as well, as far as having Anne Rice's interview with the vampire and all that ultimately be not necessarily that shift in sexual undertones and the homoeroticism. Like I said, as far as I've been able to tell, that's been a thing since Carmilla and
Yeah,
Polidori and all of that. But to do that shift from the focus of how the vampire affects those around them to sort of humanizing them and having it be how they would exist as a different form of human being. Like they would still have their emotions and they would still have affections and all of those things. So no, I absolutely agree. That's kind of where that shift happened, and everything since then has kind of been reflective of that.
I feel, yeah, I mean, I do feel that way, but I also think that there is power in something like From Dusk Till Dawn, which has the vampires as pure monsters. A little so my best friend and I in college, he's still my best friend, amazingly still my best friend. I don't know how I'm so lucky. We were hanging out with a couple of friends and they had rented the VHS From Dusk Till Dawn, and I didn't realize it, but he didn't know it was a vampire movie. And so we're watching it, and like the first hour is a crime movie, right? And then everyone turns into vampires. And it gets crazy. And he was freaked out. He's like, what the hell? He's like twice my size. He was a linebacker in high school. And we're walking home. It's night. And my apartment, there's an alley. And we'd go through the alley and up the back door. I'm like, let's do the back door tonight. I just, and it's like, okay. And so we're going and we're walking and it's dark. I'm like, hey, do you hear that? It's like, what? I'm like, shh. I suddenly turned. I was like, rah! He jumped up in the air. It was like, dude. It was. I'm lucky he didn't beat the crap out of me. But I think the effectiveness of From Dusk Till Dawn is because they're monsters, right? Had them become like Edward Cullen's, like, beautiful, let me drink your blood, or whatever, or Lestat's even like, oh, let me seduce you, and what, blah, 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 what, if you went that way, it wouldn't have been jarring, right? And I do appreciate films that offer that monstrous vision of the vampire, because I feel like the Lestat vision, when it's done well, it's done beautifully well. I don't know if you've seen, what was it called? And Period, I think, did a film back in the 90s that I think Christopher Walken was in that was really cool. I don't remember much. There's just a lot to be had with a vampire. And I think any genre figure that has that much flexibility is I don't feel like Frankenstein has the flexibility Dracula does. which is why I don't think we see as many different Frankenstein films as we do overall vampires. So I think that's really a lot of what gives it kind of that sense of immortality. I also think something like Blade was refreshing in that it was an action vampire film, action vampire superhero film. So you can throw that figure into different genres. You can even throw Dracula into different genres and have it work because it's so iconic and such a straightforward analogy, of a character.
Yeah, and that ties back to something. The difference between those vampires that we focus on for their story, Dracula and all that, and that sort of Legion style vampire in Dusk Till Dawn or
Yeah.
Blade, even, to where it seems like as time has gone on since the 1800s and those early vampire novels, they were afraid of the monsters, to where now they seem to have shifted more into something that entertains us when it's that style of Legion, right? Blade or Underworld and things like that.
Underworld. Oh, I love the design in that movie. Like I love the designs in that film. I've only seen the first one, so all I could sit through, but yeah, early 2000s, man.
Even that, though, the style of that film was very indicative of the generation it was made. Not unlike Blade or Queen of the Damned, right? Like the soundtrack is very indicative of the generation.
Blade, it's funny, the first Blade, I think, special effects aside, holds up really well because of how Stephen Norrington directed it. Guillermo del Toro did the second, and actually my department chair worked on that. My chair, Ty Ruben Ellingson, worked for he did concept design at ILM, Industrial Light and Magic, for a bit, and then moved on. He worked on like Jurassic Park, Star Wars, a special edition. Dude's got some cred. He actually broke his I think he shattered his elbow doing motion capture for Jurassic Park. There's a scene when like a whole bunch of dinosaurs kind of run. It's like a stampede. There's one that trips and falls. That's Ty. He like fell and busted. So they named the dinosaur Ty. But he went on and did a lot for Del Toro, and he did some designs in Blade, including, I think, like the bomb. I think he designed that. But yeah, we watched Blade 2 in I think it was my comic book to film class. I had not seen it since the 90s. That movie did not hold up well.
The second one.
The second one.
Yeah.
It did not hold up well. But yeah, I think you're absolutely dead on. The beauty of doing a period piece is that it's not dated except in how it's filmed, right? But the problem with doing the good and bad about doing contemporary is it's good because it's a window into the culture of the time. I think it's a big open window, like Dracula 2000 by Wes Craven. It's awful. But kind of by that point in like the 90s and early 2000s, everything had to be all sexy and graphic and kind of had a straight to video feel, except it was in theaters. You really did have that, and I'm curious where the vampire is going to go from here. Personally, if you go with Dracula as someone who can't have his picture taken or reflection, that to me is the most empowering thing, because I could have privacy again. I mean, really think about it. Like, there's always that question: would you let yourself be turned into a vampire? And for me, in the plus column is, I could be a shadow if I wanted to. No one could catch me on a security camera, anywhere. I could go about my life not having to worry about being like immortalized somewhere and having my basic, not that I would use it to commit crimes or anything, that could be a cool story. A cat burglar who becomes a vampire because, hey, now I don't have to worry about anything. can do my job. You know, but to me, there's something empowering about that. Now, back in the 1960s, they didn't have security cameras everywhere. They didn't have identity theft. That's not a thing. The 1980s, you know, there's such a fear of HIV/AIDS, you know, 80s and even 90s, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, it's still there, obviously, but I feel like it was at its height in the 80s when they didn't fully know what it was or where it came from. And when you have this bloodborne disease, which is vampirism, it's, you know, I mean, it's a really, to me, it's a really blatant, obvious parallel. But you can, you know, because you have those really strong kind of analogies you can form, you can use it to really drive a more powerful story than you can with, I feel like, most other genre figures, even ghosts. Incidentally, have you seen Being Human, the BBC show, not the American one? That's rubbish.
I think I saw some of the American one, but that was more just because I'm a big Sam Witwer fan than anything else.
I love Sam Witwer. You know what? I'm going to go on a little tangent.
Okay.
But the fact that they didn't cast him in any of the sequels as anyone is a crime. The Star Wars sequels, for those of you guys who don't know him, because he's done like some motion capture for the video games. He voices Darth Maul. But I mean, my feeling about the Star Wars sequels is they had this guy, Dave Filoni, who's a producer, writer, and he's George Lucas's right-hand man. And why they didn't give him the sequels, even as a producer, it's beyond me. It's the analogy I told someone is, it's like if you live with an electrician and you hire a contractor to fix your outlet, you know. But Witwer's amazing. The British version, you know, the premise is it's a ghost, a vampire, and a werewolf who all live in a flat. And it's 6 episodes, and it's the tightest, like, I mean, it's amazing. It is like absolutely one of like my favorite. And the young lady who plays the ghost is, I mean, they're all brilliant, but she really kind of stole my heart because she's just like, she has so much range. Annie is the character's name. She's so likable. But if you can check out the first season, it's absolutely worth it. They do some things with vampires that I think are pretty cool that I haven't seen, you know, really anywhere else.
Awesome. Well, I think we're closing in on about an hour.
Hey man, I could talk all night. This was enjoyable.
No, I 100% agree, and we may have you back for a separate interview at some other point. Talk a bit more about what, as far as I understand, your big passion and profession is the comic book genre.
Yeah, it's a medium. Yeah, the comic book medium. It's got a bunch.
Medium, correct. Sorry.
Back here, and yeah, this is my neater shelf.
Oh.
Yeah, my office is a mess because I have an almost 4-year. Oh yeah. What you got back there?
I'll show you in a minute after we.
Yeah, and I'll totally judge you by it. Yeah, and I've got my laptop so I can show you some nice stuff here. But yeah, I'm always happy to talk comics. Doing my dissertation on kind of the superhero adapted into film from the 70s through early 2000s. But yeah, I mean, if you guys have any further questions, you want to do a follow-up, you've got my email, let me know. I'm always happy to talk. And I'm honestly super flattered that anyone would want to use, you know, something I did and had a lot of fun with my friends in a class. That actually means a lot. Oh, final suggestion. It's crazy as hell. My students either love it or they hate it. There's I think it's a South Korean film called Rigor Mortis that has a vampire in it, sort of. It's really weird. I love the movie. After I showed it to one horror class, I had one horror class just thought it was the best. It's very graphic, just a warning. The second horror class, like one of my kids looked at me and thought, "What the hell, Irving? What was that?" But it's a very different take on vampires that I think some of you guys might dig.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. I know I've said it in planning this a dozen times already, but
No, man, you had good interviewer. This is a lot of fun. I'd gladly do another interview if you need me.
I may hold you to that. But
I'll hold you to that.
yeah, with that, I think we'll call it a night. Thank you one last time, and